The world is stunned after Julian Lennon, son of legendary Beatle John Lennon, has finally broken his silence, and what he confessed has left fans speechless. In a recent, deeply emotional interview, Julian admitted something he had kept hidden for decades. "I truly hated her." The confession, raw and shocking, wasn't about fame, fortune, or music. It was about deep wounds, family betrayal, and the painful shadow of being John Lennon's son. For years, Julian has lived with the burden of being compared to his father, the world's peace icon and one of the most celebrated musicians in history. But behind that fame was a complicated, often heartbreaking family dynamic. When John left Julian's mother, Cynthia Lennon, for Yoko Ono, Julian was just a child. What followed was years of emotional distance, confusion, and resentment, feelings that shaped Julian's entire life. Now, decades later, Julian is finally ready to talk about what those years were really like: the loneliness, the anger, and the long journey toward forgiveness. His confession isn't just shocking because of the words themselves, but because of the raw honesty behind them. For a man who grew up in the shadow of one of the world's most admired figures, expressing such pain took enormous courage. In the interview, Julian revealed that his hatred wasn't born out of jealousy, but heartbreak. He felt abandoned, not just by his father, but by the new life John created with Yoko Ono. "I felt like I didn't matter anymore," he admitted quietly. "Like I was erased." Now, at 62, Julian Lennon is finally peeling back the curtain on one of music's most complicated family stories, a story of love, betrayal, and reconciliation that has haunted him for half a century. What he says next changes everything fans thought they knew about the Beatles' most famous family. Before the fame, before the bitterness, Julian Lennon was simply a little boy who wanted his father's love. Born on April 8, 1963 in Liverpool, Julian was the first child of John Lennon and Cynthia Powell, back when the Beatles were still climbing toward stardom. His earliest memories were of modest beginnings: a small house, a hard-working mother, and a father who was rarely home but always seemed to be chasing something bigger. To the world, John Lennon was a genius in the making. To Julian, he was a ghost who appeared and disappeared without warning. As the Beatles exploded into worldwide fame, John's attention shifted almost entirely to the band. Cynthia, devoted and patient, tried to keep their marriage afloat while raising Julian alone for weeks on end. "Dad was always away," Julian later recalled. "When he was home, he was tired, distracted, or thinking about the next song. I didn't really know him." The loneliness of those early years left a lasting mark. Cynthia tried to fill the void with love and stability, but even she couldn't shield her son from the growing cracks in their family. John's fame brought chaos, and with it came temptation, drugs, fame, and the kind of freedom that didn't include responsibility. By the time Julian was 5, the marriage had begun to crumble. Then came Yoko Ono, a name that would forever change the Lennon family. When John met Yoko in 1966, he was instantly captivated. Their connection was electric, artistic, and deeply personal. But for Cynthia and Julian, it marked the beginning of the end. "One day he was my dad," Julian once said. The next day he was someone else entirely. The breakup was brutal. John's affair became public, and Cynthia was left devastated. She took Julian away from the chaos, hoping to protect him. But the pain of being left behind by his father never truly faded. John moved on quickly, publicly declaring his new relationship and leaving his old life, and his son, in the past. Julian's world changed overnight. Suddenly, he wasn't the cherished son of a Beatle, he was the forgotten one. "It was like I didn't exist," he later confessed. He had a new life, a new woman, a new son. "I was just the leftover." As Julian grew older, the distance between him and John became more painful. While John embraced his new identity with Yoko and their son, Sean, Julian watched from afar, confused and angry. The man who preached love and peace to the world seemed incapable of showing it to his own child. The world adored John Lennon for his message of unity. But behind closed doors, Julian struggled to understand how the man who sang "All You Need Is Love" could turn away from his firstborn. Cynthia often comforted him, reminding him that his father loved him in his own way, but even she couldn't mend the emotional scars. Julian began to see Yoko not just as the woman who took his father away, but as a symbol of everything he had lost: family, connection, and identity. "I hated her," Julian admitted years later. "Not because she was evil or cruel, but because she represented the loss of my dad." While the world celebrated John and Yoko's relationship as revolutionary, Julian lived in its shadow. The contrast between the public image and his private pain was unbearable. "People saw them as this perfect couple spreading peace," he said, "but they never saw the broken family left behind." By his teenage years, Julian was channeling his pain into music, following in his father's footsteps, not out of admiration, but as a way to make sense of it all. Every note he played carried a trace of the boy who once waited by the window, hoping his father would come home. The seeds of resentment had been planted deeply. And though time would change many things, the wound of abandonment and the bitterness toward the woman who replaced his mother would stay with Julian for decades. After his parents' separation, Julian Lennon tried to move on, but the wounds left by his father's absence grew deeper with each passing year. The world saw John Lennon and Yoko Ono as the ultimate symbols of love and peace, but for Julian, that public image only made his private pain harder to bear. "It was like watching my dad live this perfect new life on television," he once said. "Everyone adored him, and I was on the outside looking in." When John and Yoko married in 1969, the divide between father and son widened. Julian, then only 6, was left in England with his mother, Cynthia, while his father built a new world in New York with Yoko. The calls were rare, the visits even rarer. "He'd send gifts sometimes," Julian remembered, but they felt like apologies wrapped in paper, gestures to fill the silence. Yoko Ono became a constant presence in every memory Julian had of his father after that point. She wasn't just his stepmother, she was the woman who had changed everything. To Julian, she had taken the man he loved and turned him into someone unrecognizable. "I lost my dad the moment he met her," he said in one interview. "And I didn't just lose him to another woman. I lost him to another world." As John and Yoko welcomed their son Sean Lennon in 1975, Julian's feelings of abandonment deepened. He adored his little brother, but seeing John embrace fatherhood so lovingly the second time around was a bitter pill to swallow. "He was the dad to Sean that I never had," Julian admitted. "He'd changed. He'd become gentle, patient. It hurt to know that I never got that version of him. The distance between father and son might have remained forever unresolved until tragedy struck on. December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed outside his New York apartment. The world mourned the loss of a legend. But for Julian, it was different. It wasn't just a global tragedy. It was the end of any chance for closure. "I didn't get to say goodbye," he said quietly, "and I didn't get to tell him how I felt." In the aftermath, Yoko Ono took control of John's estate, managing his legacy, his music, and his memory. For Julian, it was another devastating blow. He was largely excluded from his father's inheritance, while Sean and Yoko received the majority of the estate. Legal battles soon followed, painful, public, and humiliating. "It wasn't about the money," Julian clarified years later. "It was about fairness, about acknowledgement. I just wanted to be treated as his son." Behind closed doors, bitterness festered. Julian found himself trapped between love and resentment, mourning a father who was both a hero and a stranger. Yoko's control over John's legacy felt suffocating. "She always wanted to protect his image," Julian said. "But I felt like she was protecting a myth, not the man." For years, Julian refused to speak publicly about Yoko, but privately he wrestled with anger that wouldn't fade. Every photograph, every song, every magazine cover with Yoko by John's side, it reminded him of what he'd lost. "It was like she was always there," he confessed, "even when she didn't need to be." Music became his outlet. Julian poured his pain into songwriting, often echoing the themes of love, loss, and reconciliation that had defined his father's career. His debut album, Velada, 1984, was filled with haunting melodies that subtly reflected his inner turmoil. One lyric from the song, Too Late for Goodbyes, seemed to say it all. Ever since you've been gone, I've been out of my mind. Despite his success, Julian's personal life remained haunted by unresolved feelings. He avoided interviews about the Beatles, rarely spoke of his father, and refused to engage in public feuds with Yoko, though the bitterness was always there beneath the surface. I carried that hate for a long time, he admitted in one rare moment of honesty. It was heavy, and it poisoned me. Decades passed before Julian finally decided to speak out, not for revenge, but for peace. And when he did, his confession stunned the world. It wasn't just a headline. It was the truth of a man who had spent a lifetime trying to forgive. For years, Julian Lennon had remained silent about his true feelings toward Yoko Ono. He gave polite answers, but time has a strange way of softening even the hardest hearts. As Julian grew older, he began to reflect on his father's choices and Yoko's role in his life, with new perspective. I used to see her as the villain, he admitted. But as I got older, I realized she wasn't the only one at fault. My dad made his choices, and maybe he needed her in ways I'll never understand. Still, the path to forgiveness wasn't easy. Julian spoke about meeting Yoko again in later years, trying to rebuild a fragile bridge. It was awkward, emotional, he said. We talked, but there was always something unspoken between us, a history that couldn't be erased. He didn't sugarcoat his feelings. I can't pretend we're close, he said candidly. There's respect now, but not love. I've learned to let go of the hate because it was destroying me. Julian's honesty struck a chord with fans around the world. For decades, the Lennon story had been told from one side, the side that celebrated John and Yoko's love as untouchable. But Julian's confession revealed the other side, the pain of a forgotten son who had carried the burden of fame, loss, and resentment for an entire lifetime. I don't hate her anymore, Julian said quietly. But there was a time when I did, truly. Because I didn't understand. I was a boy who just wanted his dad back. That confession didn't just free him from years of silence. It allowed fans to see the real human story behind one of music's most iconic families. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about truth, healing, and finally putting the past to rest. And for the first time in decades, Julian Lennon felt peace, not from his father's words, but from his own. In the years that followed his painful confession, Julian Lennon began a quiet transformation. The boy who once lived in the shadow of John and Yoko slowly started to find his own light. He realized that carrying resentment was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. After decades of bitterness, Julian was finally ready to heal, not for Yoko, not for his father, but for himself. I spent most of my life running from my past, he admitted. Every time someone mentioned the Beatles, I felt like that abandoned little boy again. But I realized that I couldn't keep living like that. My father's story is part of mine, whether I like it or not. Julian began reconnecting with the people who had been part of his father's world, trying to understand the man beyond the myth. Old friends told him stories about John's humor, his vulnerability, his constant search for meaning. For the first time, Julian saw glimpses of the father he never truly knew. Not the global icon, but the flawed, fragile human being behind the fame. That understanding opened the door to something unexpected: forgiveness. It didn't happen overnight, Julian said. It took years to let go. I had to accept that my father made mistakes, huge ones, but he also tried to change. Maybe not for me, but at least for Sean. And in a strange way, that gave me peace. One of the biggest steps in Julian's healing came through his relationship with his half-brother, Sean Lennon. For a long time, their connection was strained, not by choice, but by circumstance. Sean had grown up with the father Julian never had, and that difference was hard to ignore. But as they grew older, The brothers found common ground through music and mutual respect. "Sean's a good soul," Julian said softly. "He didn't choose any of this either. He lost his father, too, and he's had to live with that legacy just like I have. We both carry different pieces of the same man." Julian's renewed relationship with Sean also brought him closer, cautiously, to Yoko Ono. Though they would never share a traditional family bond, there came a moment when Julian chose to forgive her, quietly and without ceremony. "I realized that holding on to hate wasn't hurting her. It was hurting me," he said. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means freeing yourself from the weight of what can't be changed. Over time, Julian began honoring his father's memory in his own way. Instead of trying to live up to John Lennon's legend, he built a legacy of his own, through music, photography, and humanitarian work. His projects, like the White Feather Foundation, were born from the very values his father once sang about: peace, compassion, and love. "The irony isn't lost on me," Julian admitted with a faint smile. "My father preached peace to the world, but I had to find it for myself." He started performing again, and even began to reintroduce some of his father's music into his shows, not out of obligation, but as a gesture of reconciliation. When he performed Imagine publicly for the first time, fans were stunned. It was raw, emotional, and deeply symbolic. "I did it to honor him," Julian said. "Not as John Lennon's son, but as Julian, the man who finally understands what that song really means." By the time he turned 60, Julian's tone toward his father and Yoko had softened entirely. He no longer spoke with bitterness, but with wisdom. "I used to say I hated her," he reflected. "But hate is just love turned inside out. What I really felt was pain. And once I faced that pain, I was free." In interviews, he began to express gratitude, not for what he lost, but for what those losses taught him. "If my life had been perfect, I wouldn't have learned empathy. I wouldn't understand what it means to forgive," he said. "Now I see my father and Yoko as part of my story, not my scars." Today, Julian lives a quiet, peaceful life. He continues to create art, raise awareness for global causes, and maintain a close relationship with Sean. The anger that once defined him has faded, replaced by something purer: acceptance. "I'll never have the father-son story I wanted," he said in one of his most emotional interviews. "But I've made peace with that, because forgiveness isn't about the past. It's about freeing your future." And with that, Julian Lennon, the son who once said, "I truly hated her," finally found the thing his father sang about half a century ago: love.